All right, I'm going to let everyone in.
Let them in, John. Let them in. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hey. Hi, Deanne. Hope you're well. It's been a while. Greg Hedges. Good.
How are you, buddy?
Good, mate. Good to see you. It's been a while.
Likewise. You don't age, you bugger. Well done.
I've got a lot more grey hair than we've heard. Last time we saw each other, mate.
Well done.
You can hear everything and they can hear you?
Yes. Look, I'm sorry, I can't get my video started.
Oh, that's okay, Vera. That's fine. That's fine.
And there's 3 of us here.
Oh, okay, cool. Hey, Glenda. Good to see you again.
Hi, team. Going?
Yep, pretty good. Pretty good. All right. How many people have we got in there now, John, in the room?
I've come on too. It's Nairi here.
Hi, Nari.
Yeah.
How are you?
Can you see me?
Can. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Cool.
I'm very good. I've just gone from one session to another.
All right. Well, look, I might ask if everybody can just put their mute on, just because otherwise we might get feedback through the mics. And we're recording this as well, so hopefully everybody's okay with that. We've had 52 people register tonight, but I'm assuming that there'll be a drop off. So I'd like to sort of share the video with people that haven't been able to make it later on. But we might get started. So I think first things is just to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet. We pay our respects to the elders of past, present and future and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. Tonight, we've got a 90-minute session and we'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So please feel free to jump in and ask questions. John Lim's my colleague, and John's going to moderate. So if you want to get onto the chat or raise your hand or just sort of unmute and shout your question, please do. And one of our colleagues, Andy, he's not able to join us now, but he will be joining at about 6 o'clock to talk a bit about sort of the global context around deliberative development. So we might get into it because I do really want to, what happens with these sessions sometimes is we just end up talking a lot and then we don't have time for questions at the end. So I might get into it, but just first up, is there any sort of burning questions people are here to get answers to up front? It'd just be good if anybody wants to sort of flag something specifically that they're really asking us to talk about. And maybe
Greg,
as we go, yep.
Does your model cater to both those that are looking to reside in the complexes versus those that are looking to simply invest? You can sort of cover
so it does, Greg, and I can talk a bit about that as we go through. So I'll I'll address that for sure. Is there any other burning things people wanted to flag? If not, I'll get into it and just feel free to jump in.
Sorry, I came in late. Just your name. So are you Tim or?
My name's Tim. Yep.
And the gentleman with you is?
He's Tim as well. So it's fairly easy.
Oh, that's easy.
Screen. Yep. So I'm Tim Riley, and this is Tim Richardson. So thanks for joining, Vin. And then we've got John Lim, who's a colleague as well, and he's just going to moderate tonight. So, all right, well, let's get into it. So, yeah, so tonight's really about explaining a bit more about our model, and the model is a citizen-led housing model for building homes at cost. And this picture is a picture of the 3/4 of the first collective. We did a project in St George's Road in Northcote in 2013. It finished, and we got a bit of media attention, and the Age Centre photographer along, and ended up taking this nice photo of us and the families. So this project really was the start of property collectives, where myself and my high school friend Dan, who's an architect, got together and convinced a couple of friends to join in with us and develop 4 townhouses under this model. And as we were doing this project, I sort of felt like maybe other people would be interested in using this approach to build their own homes. And we've kind of gone from there. So tonight, really, we're going to walk through the model and how it works, talk about some case studies, some future opportunities, and have some time for some Q&A. So property collectives is a model of developing, but it's also about a team of people that are trying to, I suppose, improve the model all the time, and improve its ability to provide impact. And so I thought Richo could speak a little bit about the team and our advisory services.
Yeah, so we have a cooperative of like-minded property specialists, property and construction specialists. So I'm an architect and builder. Andy, who you can see on the screen in the black and white, who'll be joining us later, he's an urban planner. And then on the bottom is Chris, who's a commercial and risk manager administrator, a bit of a numbers whiz. And John is a project management and development management expert. So in addition to that, we also have cost planners, QSs, and a range of other people that work in facilities management and life cycle analysis that all sort of complement the various aspects of what is deliberative development, which is in its essence buildings that are being built for the very long term with the end user in mind. So it's really important not to just control the design and cost at the outset, it's to make sure that all of the assumptions you're making are being planned for the operational state of the building over 50 and even 100 years. So we work on property collectives projects, but we also work on a range of other build to hold sectors such as retirement living, aged care, health, and civic projects as well. So they're all quite complementary and just enhance what we do from day to day.
Thanks, Richard. So this slide really just describes the property collectives model at a very high level. And the first point is really the differentiator in the model, in that we spend a lot of time, even before we've purchased the land, bringing together a group of like-minded people who are willing to pool their financial resources and buy the land and then fund the development on its way through. After we've created what we call a core collective group, we then go through the land acquisition process, and as we move through planning and construction, the collective refines their specific needs and remains in control of the design and the build of their own project. And then when we get to the third or final stage, everybody receives their home that's customised to their needs at cost, typically around 15% less than market. So that's what we're aiming to achieve for members of each collective. and we'll go through sort of results on a couple of our completed projects in a few slides. So taking this approach, we've put together 9 collectives since 2010, building 60 homes across those 9 collectives. So what the model does is that really it enables like-minded people to boost their buying power and deliver better homes more affordably. And we do that by enabling the group to become the developer. So we act as a development manager. So we're the developer in the room, but the collective is effectively the developer. And the cost savings are realised because the group is internalising the developer margins. They're not having to pay agent marketing fees or sales commissions. And if we set the joint venture up at the start correctly, then when that third stage happens and the buildings are created and the titles are issued for the individual dwellings, well, that doesn't result in a capital gains tax event, a stamp duty event, or a GST event. So from that perspective, it's a very efficient structure for people that are looking to hold these homes for the long term. So the process is also very participatory, and by being participatory, it gives people more control over the location, the design, and the quality of their future home. And all of the members of the collective are part of that development journey, from having a say over what piece of land we're going to purchase, right through to who's the builder and which funder are we going to use to deliver the project. In terms of the process, the structure we use is a joint venture structure, and that's one of the keys to the model. Each member of the collective has a beneficial interest in the land that we purchase, and being a member of the collective gives each member one vote on the management committee. So structurally, it's quite similar to a co-op structure, one member, one vote kind of approach, but it's not actually a co-op. Decisions are made by majority and special majority, and in terms of the process that we run, one of the big impacts Richo has made since joining a couple of years ago is we're really shaping our projects around a very structured process, which we've sort of borrowed from the Royal Institute of British Architects and their REBA plan of work. And Richo might want to talk a little bit about this table and the different phases.
Yeah, one of the important things that I've observed over my time in the industry is the problems that occur when design commences prematurely and people or participants, stakeholders don't have a firm grasp of what the words of music for the objective or the development are going to be. So they start down a pathway and get emotionally attached to a design outcome, and then kind of have to reverse engineer some of the maths of doing that. And that's an abortive and stressful process, and often ends up with things like expectation gaps between members because assumptions around certain parameters were not understood, or expectations around revenue or cost were not understood or mapped out so that people could have a robust conversation before there's a design in place. In other words, people can make informed decisions before a design is actually in place, generally get much stronger alignment. And then as the design evolves, it's being measured against those key metrics that have been agreed at the outset, so that people are actually able to endorse and visualise the design developing in accordance with the recipe card that had been previously agreed at the outset. And that's a really, really strong way to move through a process, because people are then having their expectations managed in a constructive way, and the design evolves in a very methodical way based on each of these gates. So, for example, at acquisition, it's a very rudimentary set of parameters that are being agreed as the basis of that acquisition. You know, through strategic vision, that's the time at which you start to come to terms with the type of dwellings, the dwelling mix, the size of them, the number of them, and actually start to then inform what would be the most appropriate designer to engage to fulfill that strategic vision. You know, horses for courses, an architect that's appropriate for one scheme may not necessarily be appropriate for another scheme, or have the experience and track record with that municipality, because town planning strategy is very important. So in other words, we don't even choose the architect necessarily until we have a firm understanding of what is the makeup of the group and what are the core technical and planning or strategic issues that the development's going to encounter. We then
yum.
Just a question, Tim, what's your relationship to the joint venture?
Can everybody hear us? I think we just got muted for a second.
Yeah. So I think the question was what our relationship with the joint venture.
That's right.
Yeah. I'll just ask, there's just, I think someone's having dinner. Can everybody just check that they're on mute? Thanks. So in the current joint ventures, we have been joint venturers in a few of the projects. I mean, I have personally, because I've sort of been building homes to live in, but that's kind of a bit of a dual role. The relationship really is one of, I suppose, a principal consultant, where we are providing that development management expertise to the collective through the process. In some recent projects, we've also taken a role as the actual developer, where we've used a development company to contract with the builder and obtain the funding for the project. So we've had a few different approaches, I suppose, or a few different iterations of the structure to try and work out the most optimized approach to delivering projects. So yeah.
So in most cases, you're a contractor to the JV.
In all cases.
In all cases, yep.
But in some cases, we might also be participants as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
In as many as we can.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's hard because you kind of get emotionally attached to all of the projects, and you do want to participate at a number of different levels in the projects. And yeah, so we are, at the end of the day, a consultant, but it's you know, it's not a normal sort of consultant arrangement, I think, just given the way these projects kind of evolve, if that makes sense. So did you want to talk anything more about?
Yeah, I think it sort of speaks for itself, and I think it would be great if people are interested in this sort of process, looking at the REBA website, which I think is just simply architecture.com. And there's some tools in there that basically explains the philosophy associated with this very meticulous approach to design, ideation through development and then delivery. And it gives you an appreciation of how we chunk out things in a very methodical way, so that we're not looking to get into the detail before we've resolved the bigger picture. And what we find is this whole approach allows for an orderly way for even people with limited to no experience in property or construction or design to engage authentically with the process that we're going through, so that we're not precluding voices having a role or something to say at very key points in the project, because we're breaking it down into its component parts and moving it forward in that way. What we actually find out is this actually reduces the overall development duration because we avoid abortive design work. In other words, we avoid a situation where we embark on a design solution only to find out later that it's compromised in its ability to realise the aspirations of the cohort. So we've got a lot of processes and we sort of manage that really effectively. So it's a good discipline that we've imposed on ourselves and the structure of the business.
Yeah, and it's a discipline I think that I've been very keen to impose on myself and the projects through, you know, delivering the first few projects and kind of realising that this is, you know, the process which I've described at a high level is critical to a project's success. So look, this is a snapshot of our current list of projects. So the 9 projects I mentioned before, we're building 60, or we've completed the 3 projects sort of grayed out in Thornbury and Northcote. And we've got another 6 in various stages of being completed. So I suppose the things to call out here is that most of our projects have been, apart from the first one, which is 4, all the 4 dwellings, the projects that came after that are all around 6 to 10 dwellings in size. And they're all sort of located within, I suppose, 5 to 7 k's of the CBD. There have been predominantly townhouse projects, although we are starting to do more apartments. And in terms of, I suppose, the results, you know, as you can see there in those sort of black call outs, we've managed to deliver savings of around 12.5 to 16% across the projects that we've finished, which sort of is then informing, you know, our objective around delivering projects at around a 15% saving to the market. So the next few slides just really just running through some of our completed projects to just give you a flavour of what we've been up to. This is 132 St George's Road in Northcote. It's a 4 townhouse project. We did this project between 2010 and 2013. Land economics was quite different back then. When they were completed, each townhouse cost around $630,000 to deliver. So that was the rolled up total cost, including the land and finance fees, taxes, council fees, professional fees, construction. And on completion, the valuations all came back at around that 730 mark, because we had 4 participants all getting individual mortgages to take out. We had different valuers come in and value the individual units. So of course they brought them all in slightly differently, but the average was around 730,000. And last year, one of the units sold for 1.1 million. The second project we finished is at 121.
How many bedrooms was in that?
They were all 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom townhouses with 1 car spot. The second project we finished is at 121 Clark Street in Northcote. So this was a 7 townhouse project. And this project went from 2014 to 2018. It cost, on average, each participant a little bit over $1 million. And once again, the same process occurred with the valuation. So there was a spread of valuations that came through on completion, but they all came in sort of around that 1.175 mark. The third project we finished was 6 townhouses in Thornbury at 4 Streddle Street. And this project went from 2015 to 2019. So finished about a year after the Clark Street project. And the cost and the values on this project came in quite similar to the Northcote project.
Could you give the number of bedrooms as you go through, Tim? Otherwise, it's sort of meaningless to me. Like, is it 1 bedroom or is it 4?
All these 3 projects were all 3-bedroom townhouses, all with 2 bathrooms, some with powders. And in Clark Street, there was 2 car parks for each dwelling, apart from 1. And in Streddle Street, there was 2 car parks for each dwelling. So most of the projects that we're doing at the moment are really focused on a 3-bedroom townhouse product. I mean, and I think that's reflective of, you know, a few things. Firstly, the original vision around the first project was around an architecturally designed 3-bedroom townhouse that was more affordable. And I think because of that first St George's Road project, once people sort of cottoned on or were interested in this approach, it just sort of happened that other people were also interested in that sort of type of home, like a 3-bedroom townhouse. So a lot of, I suppose, where we've got to now has been built off the back of the popularity of a 3-bedroom townhouse, albeit now that with our West Brunswick project, which I'll run through in a little bit, you know, we've in that project, we've got 10 apartments. Some of them are smaller apartments, although they're still quite generous. It's sort of like 90 square metres. Some are 2 bedrooms plus a study. And then some are 4-bedroom apartments, and that's just been driven purely by the participants and what they're interested in building.
Tim, Greg here. Just a quick question on duration of project. What's the typical turnaround time? Was it in fact 4 years for this particular project, the one you've got on screen at the moment?
Yeah, it was. It was January 2019 we finished, I think, and we bought in the middle of 2015. So I sort of always say to people to expect 3.5 to 4 years in terms of project duration. It probably surprises quite a few people that it takes that long, but it does. You know, I think if you add in the time to acquire as well, it absolutely will take that long. And, you know, there are some wild cards that it's hard to predict, particularly the planning process. But once you are through the planning process, you know, you can control the other parts of the process quite well in terms of time, I think. And you know, these projects are also reflecting that we delivered these projects quite sequentially in terms of that process. Whereas now on a lot of our projects, particularly with Richo's assistance around our development pathway, you know, we're running a lot of those stages in parallel to sort of speed up the process.
Thanks, Tim.
So the next couple of slides talk a little bit about how collectives get formed, and really there's sort of broadly two ways. The first way is the collective forms prior to land acquisition, and in the 9 collectives we put together, that's how they've all come together. The second way is where we acquire the land prior to collective formation, and increasingly we are looking at that option for future projects. So in the first instance, like I mentioned, we spend quite a lot of time curating, I suppose is for want of a better term, a group of people that are interested in getting involved in a project. And the thing that typically will bring people together is a desire to get into a certain location. And once we have a core collective formed, we'll then go through and start the land acquisition phase. So the second option, you are sort of reversing the process whereby you're going out and acquiring the land first, or entering into some sort of joint venture with a landowner, and then you are going out and forming the collective. And this second option is, I suppose, and Andy will talk a bit more about the overseas experience, but this second option is more common in Europe, where this sort of model's a bit more popular, a bit more established. But like I said, for the current collectives, we haven't put any collectives together under the second option at the moment, but for future projects, we are absolutely sort of looking at that approach. So if a collective is coming together without a site, this slide really talks about the process of how that happens. So before we go looking for a site, we make sure we have a core collective of around 1/3 to 1/2 of the future joint venturers on board. And these joint venturers shape the project because they're there at the start of the project. And I suppose it's their desires and their vision which I suppose disproportionately are impacting that project because they're there at the start. And after we find and acquire a site, the balance of participants are found from our network. And this is how all of the 9 current collectives have formed. We've always secured the land with around 1/3 to 1/2 of the joint venturers in place. So if you look at sort of those black circles, really people are coming to us as individuals or groups. They may be owner occupiers or long-term investors. And to your question, Greg, at the moment, we've got a bit over half the participants are owner occupiers and the balance are long-term investors. We don't really mind whether people are owner occupiers or investors. What we do care about is that people share, I suppose, our desire to work on delivering really good quality homes. That's, I suppose, was the genesis of why I started property collectives, because I wasn't seeing a high quality product being delivered in sort of the medium density space. That's why Dan and I decided to try and do it ourselves. And regardless of whether someone's looking at it to live in or rent out, we really want those participants to be on the same page around their values and their objectives around what they're interested in creating. So
yeah, there's a completely different dynamic in terms of all of the decisions that get made and the priorities when you're not delivering something speculatively to hand over the keys at completion. When you're invested in it for 50 years or more, all the decisions you make are fundamentally based on value and less on cost. Obviously, cost is important because we're looking to create value in an economic sense. But the decisions around design and materials and aging gracefully and fitness for purpose, they all underpin that proposition about an asset that is going to improve and add value and be a high quality place for its residents for many generations. So once we have that in place, it does tie in with it all. It's not to say that people don't exit at completion, they do, their situation changes, but for the most part, everyone's investing in a high quality addition to the building stock.
So the yellow circles really are talking at a very high level around that process that we go through in terms of meeting with people. Step 2 is the finance assessment. So we do go through a process with everybody in reviewing their financial situation, so we can have confidence that if they join a collective, they've got the capacity to support the collective on the way through. And then obviously step 3 there, the legals and participation agreement. Well, you know, people obviously need to get a good grasp of the joint venture legal structure, what their rights and responsibilities are, and how the mechanics of it all work. So, you know, really once we go through that 3-step process with people, and they are then still prepared to commit to the project, then we sort of say, okay, well, we've got this core collective, and then we will form that collective, and then we will move on to site acquisition. And yeah, I touched on this before, you know, really it is the vision of the core collective who commit early in the process that will shape the project, because we'll be working with that core group to acquire a piece of land that fits their requirements. The timing of joining also determines the order of unit selection. So this is sort of an important part of the model. We don't recommend, and we've only had one group sort of go against their recommendation tacitly, but officially they accepted our recommendation. But we don't do this selection of dwellings until after we've got a planning permit approved. And that's sort of been one of the learnings along the journey, was that it's better if everybody is working in the best interests for the overall project as long as possible before people's individual, I suppose, requirements come to the fore. And what we've found is that it's problematic if we do unit selection before we've got a planning permit, because there's a hell of a lot of design work that needs to happen before we get certainty on that design outcome. And if we have people selecting too early in the process, then people can get quite attached to a specific dwelling. And if, you know, we have to make some concessions through the planning process, which means that, you know, that specific dwelling gets changed, then, you know, that's problematic from a group dynamic perspective. So we hold off doing unit selection until after the permit's approved, but then we go through an order of selection, and that order of selection is quite simplistic in that, you know, the people that join the project earlier get a higher pick, and we do have a mechanism for financial adjustments, which makes it all very fair and equitable. So it's not about a financial outcome, that order of selection. It's just more about, I suppose, rewarding people that want to commit to the project earlier with a bit more choice over the dwellings. So this slide talks about finance and how the finance works. So there's 3 stages here, and I've put the 0 stage as the finance assessment. So that's that process we go through with everybody to review their finance, their financial position, and that's a really important stage because it will define what somebody's budget is, but it'll also give us the confidence that that person can participate, and all of the other participants also know that everybody else has been through the same process, and that's really important. The first stage there is land purchase finance. So we do get a mortgage on the land after we've purchased it. The second stage is development finance. So that's the construction loan. That will typically cover not just construction, but other development costs, including the land and professional fees, council fees, funding fees, etc. And then the third and final stage is the takeout finance. So that is everybody's individual home loans secured against their individual homes. And that takeout finance stage is the way that the second stage, the development finance, is paid out. So after the third stage takes place, basically the collective has, you know, satisfied all of its obligations and liabilities, and that they then sit with the individual owners. So on the finance assessment, I mean, really the key to this model is that participants are becoming the developer. You know, the participants are not just putting a deposit on a off-the-plan sales contract. They are funding the developer equity capital requirement. And by controlling the funding, it's allowing the collective to control the built form outcome and receive their homes at cost. So that is absolutely the differentiator with this model to any other model that's out there. The individuals need to understand that they are taking on the role of the developer. They're accepting that development risk, but they're also getting that developer reward of getting their home at cost. The members
So,
share.
Tim, the remaining 70% is at completion, is it?
No, I'll explain that flow in the next couple of slides. But the 70%, that's a static view, you know. The capital contributions come out over the 3.5 year of the project duration. But when we go for construction finance, that will typically be around 70% of the development costs. So for land acquisition, we get a loan. Historically, we've got a loan of between 50 to 70% LVR, depending on the bank and the type of property that we've purchased. The interest rate sits at, you know, anywhere between 3 to 5%. And usually it's a commercial loan because we're borrowing collectively at this point. And it's important to note that most banks will require that the joint venturers give guarantees joint and severally. So that means that if we've purchased a piece of land for $3 million and there's 10 joint venturers, well, all of the joint venturers for that land purchase finance will be jointly liable for the full 3 million, not just their 300,000. We haven't managed to identify a bank who will have any other sort of conditions on their finance. Having said that, that land purchase finance stage is quite a low risk sort of phase of the project. Where the risk starts to come into it is during construction, and this is our bank loan number 2. So at this point, we typically get between 70 to 75% of the total development costs, exclusive of GST, at around 4 to 5% interest. And once again, that's a commercial facility, which the collective is taking out as a group. At this stage, the liability can be joint and several or several. So we bank with a number of different banks, Commonwealth Bank, Bank of Melbourne, Bank Australia, and Bank of Queensland are banks that have funded these projects. Some of them require joint and several. Others will offer us several liability. So, for example, if this loan at stage 2 is not $3 million anymore, it's not a $3 million loan. Now it's sort of a $5 million loan. A several liability for 10 participants would mean that you would only be liable for $500,000 each, as opposed to the full $5 million, if that makes sense. So we're always very careful to kind of call that out because not everybody is comfortable with that sort of arrangement. But when you're dealing with commercial funding, it's kind of a reality of doing business, really. And then on completion, or when all of the titles are partitioned and then subdivided, this is when the home loans come in. And so the individual titles get issued and JVers get mortgages in their own name for their dwelling, and they pay out their share of the construction debt. And typically at that sort of 70 to 75% of cost funding, that home loan will be around about a 50 to 55% loan to value ratio. And that's because by that stage, we've created the dwellings. We've created that sort of circa 15% saving to the market. And because the group has now created that additional equity, the LVR against the completed value of the dwelling comes back and is quite low. So this slide is a bit busy, but it kind of talks to sort of the process and the time sort of across the top. I've sort of broken down the different phases there that we typically see. And, you know, to your question, Greg, we're sort of looking at 42 to 55 months. If you sort of add up all of those phases, including the collective creation phase. And then that second sort of section on this slide is talking about the equity capital contributions. So there, what we're representing is broadly 7 different capital calls throughout the project. 6 different capital calls throughout the project, and a 7th after completion, depending on what we do with GST. And broadly, what we're finding is that, you know, that first phase, which really is around land acquisition through to sort of the planning permit submission, is around about 1/3 of the total contributions coming in then. Then as we go through town planning up to, you know, getting ready to build, it's another 1/3. So those stages, capital calls 4 and 5 are sort of in that phase. And then as we start construction, the 6th capital call comes in, and that is about 1/3 typically. So hopefully that just sort of gives you a sense of, you know, broadly how that cash flow is working over time with the equity. So the next few slides have some case studies, and I think Andy's joined us now, so might get Andy involved. So are you with us, Andy?
I am.
Oh, good. Hi. So look, we've had the pleasure of working with Andy now for a number of different years, and I don't know, Andy, do you want to maybe introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an urban designer with sort of a background that blends across architecture, planning and urban design, but I'm also a complete housing history nerd, both housing policy as well as housing architecture. This is a new slide, which I haven't seen before, which is a bit more detail of some of the places I've spent a bit of time visiting projects along with Tim as well, where there's a range of different sort of homegrown models. The term deliberative development is perhaps a bit of a newer term to describe the empowerment of residents to deliberate over and finance their own development and shape their development. But there are other terminology such as co-housing or Samenhousing in the Netherlands, or Kluswoning, or whatever you want to call it, depending on which cultural context you come from, that have a really long history. Certainly in the Netherlands goes back to sort of the 1910s, in Zurich back to 1906. But I think what's been really interesting is that there's been a real sort of increase in the level of innovation in urban buildings in particular since the early 2000s. And so that's been really fascinating to see more ambitious projects that have a focus on a mix of uses and community spaces, as well as housing as well, and a whole different range of scales. So just a couple of sort of stats there. You can see, well, that's my old map, but you can see the sort of quantities that we're talking about, you know, as much as sort of 17% of housing in Zurich. I think that's out of date, that figure. It's sort of closer to 20% or something like that. But, you know, a substantial proportion of a city's housing are delivered with various forms of sort of housing where citizens are involved. In some cities, that almost performs the function that something that social housing might, but in most of these contexts that we're looking at, it forms what we kind of describe as a third sector of housing, which exists between the pure market for profit development, publicly provided or subsidised housing, and this sort of in-between space that operates between the two. Did you want to add anything else to that one?
No. Look, there is a new slide which I'm sorry for surprising you, Andy, but yeah, I thought this is interesting slide for just some global context, because I think this idea of what we're doing is quite new here in Melbourne and in Australia, although there are quite a few sort of co-housing projects around Australia in different forms, but it's been surprising to me as I sort of learnt more about kind of what we're doing and this model and sort of a global context, just how more progressed, I suppose, it is, you know, in Northern Europe in particular. Yeah.
I think it's also one of the things that's become really interesting for us is running a workshop on this on Friday, actually, with government as well as Tim and others, is that one of the kind of key differences between most of these models in the European context in particular is the presence of government in some form or another. So it might not appear initially the case, but you'll find, you know, competitive rates of land sale or lease, or some sort of green you know, loan system that you might find like KfW in Germany, or there is the hand of government is much more prominent, and that's allowed these projects to have more generous sites and more opportunity for experimentation. And I think one of the challenges working certainly within the Victorian context, but I would suggest in most of Australia, is that you're really competing with with the private market. And not getting a heck of a lot of sort of leg ups from government. So it does make it quite a different sphere to sort of the types of contexts that you'll see these projects occurring within. Certainly if I think of say in the Netherlands or in Denmark, where there's projects that might be sort of state sponsored and ground lease so that the residents don't bear the cost of land acquisition. That's something that's been really interesting for us to understand how a model here, yeah, maybe a word I would describe is it's a bit more cutthroat, the competition, to try and find sites that are really suitable where we can find opportunities for generosity. And I'll sort of touch on that in a moment. If we keep flicking through some of these, some of the examples, I'll explain an important idea about sort of interior and exterior space, which has sort of emerged through the work that the Tims have sort of been doing today. But maybe in terms of some of these collectives, I think I've mentioned that each of these kind of cultural contexts has their own homegrown models, but there are also sort of a history of certain types. And so essentially you can see models which are more of a sort of townhouse, freestanding, on its own, you know, two-dimensional title, versus sort of apartment type buildings and then projects that have hybrid. So this is, while perhaps my personal research has been a bit more focused on larger scale urban development, I think there's certainly examples of doing everything from sort of detached homes in a collective setting through to larger buildings and everything in between. And I think we've also been interested in the sort of different level of sort of facilitation in these projects. So something that's really clear between different contexts is when we use the term deliberative, it's a pretty broad band. So some projects can be purely self-initiated. So the project on the left in Amsterdam Nord is sort of 3 townhouses built together by a collective, and that wasn't professionally facilitated. They came together, they selected their designer and sort of co-developed the project. Whereas the project in the middle, in Berlin, Oederberger Strasse, there's an example where there were some architects and creatives who came together as an initial group, prepared a design, and then brought other residents in later into the project. So a little bit of a hybrid where you had an initiator of a project and then the sort of residents coming on to fund it. And then on the right-hand side, you have something quite different again, which is the Superlofts project in Amsterdam as well. And this project is an example where residents often don't have a lot of say over the design of the building, but they can pick an extraordinary diversity of apartment typologies that almost form a sort of Tetris within the building. And so that is a heavily professionally facilitated, very, you know, for lack of a better word, a sort of slick service. But at the end of the day, the residents are still funding their own development. There isn't necessarily external developers running the project. So I think the property collective model sort of sits, in my view, sort of sits somewhere in the middle. You've got the professional facilitation and support, but you've also got the residents there from day one shaping the brief, as opposed to on the right where they just choose the house that best suits their needs. And just one of the projects, this is my partner on the bottom right, sitting with our friend in her home. And I think something that we thought was really extraordinary about this project, which is a sort of cluster of individual townhouses with a rear lane, is how it's quite urban at its street frontage, you know, sort of 3-story buildings built to boundaries, perhaps more typical of a Paddington or a Carlton or something like that. But you can see this zone in the rear of these quite large gardens that form a collective effect. And while these residents all had permits initially to build fences, as they've built their projects over time, and some have been able to afford better gardens and some are doing it more incrementally, you actually see the residents sort of forming and making decisions together over time. And so by building together and meeting in the early phases, they've actually made decisions not to pull down and not to build the fences that they were entitled to. So in this case, looking from our friend Birgit's apartment, we can see there's a Polish lady who lives in the house directly opposite, and while we were visiting having a beer, she dropped her child off unannounced, and we looked after her child for the next hour and a half. So we thought that was a pretty beautiful, if not confronting, demonstration of how people have sort of worked together. And I think the important thing to note is this is a community that moved into a master plan that was already established. So in terms of their level of coordination in the outset, it was very much they met once their projects were established. So that this even shows that through the building phase and after the initial phase of completion, there's still that scope to sort of work together. It also points to something I'll touch on again in a minute, which is that idea of what can you leave open-ended? You know, in this, we have a particular way of delivering projects, and banks have a certain way of valuing them that says that we should, you know, have everything complete and perfect, but maybe leaving a patch of dirt that's remediated and ready for you to do whatever you want with it is actually a really cost-effective way of enabling the community to form, and you might allocate a small budget to that over time, rather than having this very polished, shiny thing at the end of completion. Balkslotterham is another really interesting one, which is individual townhouses built over time. One of the projects I mentioned before is here. And what I find really extraordinary about this project is the way in which there are planning requirement, which essentially required a certain setback from the street for substation noises from a nearby sort of electrical installation, created this incredible sunny front yard condition where, rather than these private backyards or balconies, the sort of collective effect of this green area was able to be added to over time. And again, residents chose not to put up fences, and some of them actually coordinated 3 gardens together so they got a larger one. And I thought some of these sort of initiatives that come from the unbuilt areas of the site were really just as interesting as the built areas. So we go to the next one. And then this is another one which was really interesting to me, which starts to see a bit more efficiency. So with the previous 2 projects, every building is essentially a different architect, a different building, and that adds a fairly extraordinary level of cost addition to the project, and a lot of redundancy in building incrementally, house by house rather than together. This is a project in Rotterdam, which I had the opportunity to visit a couple of years ago, that won a sort of national architecture prize. And what it was able to do is work with a group of sort of 19 residents and come up with a consistency of material palette, of window types and other sort of efficiencies across the projects, but still see some differences in the floor plan between each one. And I think this idea of how you coordinate the efficiencies across a broader precinct while still getting that sense of your own individual home, I thought was a really interesting example. And then this is kind of at the other end, where Zander Roth architects in Berlin, and these photos unfortunately are probably a bit earlier in the phase. That's now a completely overgrown jungle, and it's a delightful wild space with lots of kids running around it. But what's really interesting about this one is the architecture is very much set. So the efficiency and the kind of quality is extraordinary. The quality of finish is probably much higher than the previous projects that we showed, but that is achieved through this kind of efficient replication of a sort of a building. But what then becomes really important is the role of the porches and the front doors, and the arrival of each residence becoming something that becomes customized over time. So you can almost think of this as a more firm scaffold within which people's lives can kind of animate the architecture. this then takes that to the extreme where it even hides any sense of the difference in the building. So these are extraordinarily high passive house, timber construction apartments within Hamburg, which were built as a reference to a sort of old 19th century typology, and they were sort of revisiting it anew in the city, which is a sort of lovely idea. But this is a case where they took the repetition to the severe and even sort of hid the larger apartments on top of the sort of car spaces. And what I actually like about this project is that they were able to both provide parking on the corners off these little car courts, which became adaptable, while keeping the frontages very pedestrian oriented and allowing people to get usable ground floor space, which is a real challenge if you want aging in place. The importance of having a bedroom, a living area, a bathroom on the same level is critical. And often the car in Australian cities can be a real barrier to that, because it lifts the living areas, it lifts the bedrooms above the ground floor and can remove that opportunity without a lift. So I thought this was a really clever solution to doing that. And these just really highlight that idea again of what do you leave unfinished? And these are three of some of my favourite projects in the world. Spreefeld on the left in Berlin. This is the original 19th century example I just mentioned in Hamburg. And on the right is a project called Grounded Living, just outside of Delft in the Netherlands. And each of these projects provided spaces that became richer through the residents' use. So the garden committee, with a small budget, was able to over time make collective decisions and improve the quality of the space. And so the image on the right, they'd actually dedicated about 80% of their site to landscape, but they literally left it as dirt and weeds. And over time were able to incrementally focus their efforts on part by part, and were very much inspired by permaculture principles in terms of their emphasis of effort on certain areas of the site over time. But this, I guess, highlights some of these parameters, and this is something that Tim and I sort of prepared before a presentation a little while ago to some Canberra, prospective Canberra residents. I think I saw some familiar names on that list before, but just a way of sort of unpacking this idea of how you think about space. I think often we see these great projects in the Netherlands or Germany that have these fantastic big communal rooms, and we sort of don't perhaps realise what the cost per unit can be of that. So if you provide 10 apartments and have a very large communal room, then you're dividing the cost of that sort of 10 ways between each apartment. So very high cost for each dwelling within that project that's just sort of being lost. So it'll put up the price of the overall project. So I guess what we've found looking at a lot of these projects is that there's a kind of sweet spot with project scale of the sort of apartment scale on the top left there, where you can start to afford additional communal rooms and things like that, because there's efficiencies that come with a building of that scale. Whereas with the townhouse scale and the types of sites that are suitable, the ability to fund those sorts of indoor spaces becomes a lot more difficult unless you have a lot of townhouses in order to cross-subsidise that. So the difference between a communal space indoors, which you're paying quite a high rate to deliver, versus the outdoor space becomes a really interesting question. So if you can find sites that has a strange planning setback or a floodplain overlay that requires you to not build in that part of the site, or a significant tree that you can't build around, what that actually does is it frees up land within the site that you can use for other things. And so actually the planning constraints can become an incredibly important thing to enable generosity. So I think if you're, depending on the scale that you're looking at, will shape to a degree, for better or worse, what type of communal opportunities are possible and at what cost. But I think that's in looking at sites, often looking for the weird ones that have some requirements that generate a lot of green open area can be incredibly advantageous, because you can come back later and build structures in there and improve the landscape, etc. I also think parking is something important to reflect on, both as a space consumption and as a cost impact. So parking within a building and connected to each individual dwelling, it has a significant space penalty on your flexibility of how you organise space. Each car then needs circulation to access it. That means that driveway is taking up space. So thinking really carefully about cars and whether that's reducing and sharing cars, whether that's having cars in a separate structure that might be a really economical carport, and separating that out from the main buildings can create these really great opportunities to both save money and sort of liberate your site from having umpteen sort of turning circles and driveways which sort of dictate your building backwards. So I think just really thinking carefully about that relationship between the convenience of the car next to the laundry into the living area versus that space and flexibility of what you might be able to do, I think is something I'm really passionate about talking through with people about how to make trade-offs.
Thanks, Andy. So I'm just conscious of time. We've got 22 minutes left. So look, the next few slides is really a couple of case studies and sort of current future opportunities. So I will just whip through these. Happy to talk to people about them after the meeting or separately. But the first one I want to talk about is our project in West Brunswick, so the Victoria Street Collective. This is the site. It's next to the old West Brunswick Primary School, which got turned into an eco-village in probably the late 90s, I believe. And we purchased the site on the sort of right-hand side, as you're seeing, on the eastern side, highlighted in white. We are doing a 10 apartment development, and at the moment we have 8 participants. We are just about to confirm the final 2, which is very exciting. And we've managed to get an 8.3 star NACERS rating at the moment on these dwellings. So they are very efficient dwellings. And across the whole project, we're only providing 6 car spaces. So that's been a very conscious decision from the group to only go for 6 car spaces. And really the key to this project is a desire from the group to, 1, have apartments, 2, have only 6 car spaces, but 3 was to have a really generous communal garden. As you'll see in the design response, and these are some elementary renders, that we have two buildings, a northern building and a southern building. They're oriented north-south to maximise their performance. And then through the middle, we have a very generous sort of 300 square metre communal garden for everybody to enjoy. So we were very fortunate or strategic, I suppose, I'm not sure which one, but Moreland City Council, the councillors approved this a couple of weeks ago with a unanimous decision to approve across all of the councillors. So we're now sort of very busy getting into our construction drawings and tender drawings and starting to organise our finance through Bank Australia and looking to start building this project later in the year and complete it late next year. So I thought this one's a really interesting case study. 1, because it's the first project that we've done with apartments. 2, it's also the first project where we really have introduced different sized dwellings. We've sort of moved away from this sort of 3-bedroom townhouse typology, and that's been, you know, in response to a very specific brief from the participants around their budget and their spatial requirements.
And also their objectives from a sustainability, low carbon footprint, you know,
Absolutely.
low operating cost standpoint. You know, their brief that they developed, they've introduced Professor Alan Pears into the process, and he's advising us and the JV on how to realise really high value outcomes in terms of life cycle cost analysis and building technologies to get, you know, really low construction costs, because it's particularly price sensitive, you know, with the diversity of participants in it. So we need to be conscious of capital costs, but at the same time, they're obviously interested in reducing their consumption costs down the track. So we've worked very hard to balance those 2 equations and introduce innovative solutions for construction technology, as well as some of the technology that goes into the building in terms of solar and so on. So it's been an interesting one for us, where it's been the brief expanded or developed from inception to include some additional parameters that we've enjoyed responding to.
Yeah. This slide is the forecast numbers as it currently stands. So from a cost perspective, we're looking at sort of the least expensive apartment being 700,000, and then the most expensive being nearly 1.1. But from a values perspective, the cheapest dwelling will be on value around 820,000, and then the most expensive one as much as 1.3. So that kind of gives you a sense of the numbers on that project. The next few slides are really around upcoming opportunities. We'll talk a bit about the Belfield Balgrouper, which is still a possibility, although unfortunately we were not selected as preferred by Banyule City Council. So it's probably unlikely that that project's going to go ahead, but it's still not necessarily totally off the cards. The Eastside Collective is forming. We've got 3 members of this collective, and we're looking for a few more people to do a project sort of in that eastern suburbs area. The Northside Collective, we do have a group of 4 participants for that project, and we're in the process of acquiring a site at the moment for that group. We've also just been engaged by a group that's keen to do a co-housing project around Nillumbik, around the Nillumbik area and sort of the outer northeast, and they're keen to do a sort of a 20 to 25 dwelling project. And then in Byron Bay, we've formed a Byron Bay group last year, and that's probably our most challenging project given property prices in Byron Bay since COVID, but that project's we're plugging away trying to find a site for that group too. So that's a snapshot of all the projects that we've got in various stages of getting towards acquisition. And the next few slides I will go through really quickly. This is just a snapshot of the Belfield project. It was part of a divestment by Banyule City Council, who'd done a master plan. We were targeting the site on the southwestern corner. We ended up with a scheme of 35 dwellings, a mix of townhouses and apartments on top of a half basement car park, with really generous communal green to the north. This is an early sort of landscaping concept that we did as part of this EOI and RFQ process with council. Once again, this site sort of talks a little bit about the opportunities for indoor and exterior communal space. On the left, we have the Victoria Street project, and that's 10 dwellings. We have no internal communal space in that project because we've gone through that exercise with the group, and it's too expensive to deliver it at that sort of scale. Whereas, the scheme on the right, which was the Belfield project, we ended up with 35 dwellings there, and that project could afford a communal kitchen dining space of around 70 square meters, which is not massive. I mean, it's kind of the size of a small 2-bedroom apartment, but that was very much the brief from that group. And at that scale, we were able to sort of deliver that. So it starts to give you a sense of what you could do with 10 dwellings versus 35 dwellings, to Andy's point previously. And this is just a snapshot of the Belfield project. Because of the increased size of this project, the total cost of the dwellings was much lower than Victoria Street. So, we did have 1-bedroom apartments there with a forecast cost of 367,000, and then the 2-bedders sitting sort of at 517 and 534, ranging up to a 3-bedroom townhouse being at cost at 793,000. So that kind of gives you a sense for that impact on scale, and what that does to total cost of dwellings. The Eastside Collective, like I mentioned, We've got 3 members in that collective, and we're starting to look at sites. At the moment, we won't really sort of kick off that project in earnest until we probably get another 1 or 2 members on board, just knowing that in that location, really, we need to be doing something around 8 dwellings to make it sort of financially sustainable for the participants. We are working with a builder partner there called Figurehead, who are very active in sort of that area. And one of their staff members has spent a lot of time in Amsterdam and sort of educated himself around alternative ways of development, and they're really on board with this model, this alternative approach to building, and they want to support the model. So that's been great. We did a bit of a launch last year. It's just a picture from the launch of that project. And the Northside Collective, I mentioned previously, we've sort of had that group together probably since the midway through last year. We've been trying to purchase a couple of sites. We have been unsuccessful in a site in Coburg on Mary Creek. And at the moment, we've got a site in Northcote that we're looking at. Yeah, so I think that's enough talking from us. I did want to have sort of half an hour at the end of the session. We've got 11 minutes, so I've failed in that regard. But if everybody's happy to stay on for a bit longer, I think we're okay to probably stick around till maybe 1:15, so we can have at least 15 minutes of half an hour of questions. So yeah, sorry to rush the end there, but yeah, over to everybody to.
There's also some questions in the chat as well, Tim. Maybe.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe John, do you want to does anybody want to start the questions? And John can probably run through some of the chat questions if nobody wants to.
I'll kick off with a question. You're obviously doing something in Byron Bay. Is that suburban Byron Bay or is that rural Byron Bay? And are you interested in rural locations in Victoria?
So the Byron Bay collective, we've only we bid on one property in East Ballina, which is not actually in Byron Bay, but that was a function of just how nuts Byron Bay has gone. So that group is quite realistic and quite open around location. In terms of country locations, we have been talking about doing a collective in Colac Otway Shire, down that sort of way for a while. We've got a number of people that are kind of interested in that.
That's the part of town I'm interested in. So.
Oh, there you go. Well, you know, we did have a bit of a look at a site that was for sale in Lorne late last year. But yeah, look, that's sort of, it's not on that list that I went through because it's quite a fledgling group, Finn. But we do know there's a lot of people in our network that would be interested in that. Yeah.
Particularly opportunities, Tim, in regional towns, because I guess the pressure and competition for some of the sites and possibilities of what you can do are quite good. Often we have found, looking at requests for larger farm scale projects, that the planning zoning is quite restrictive in most states. So the ability to have multiple dwellings on most rural land is prohibited, not just in Victoria, but in most states. And so often that, perhaps what we might be more used to of sort of Bellingen style cooperatives and those sorts of approaches are a little bit harder these days. And that's really to stop people doing suburban subdivision. But it does make it quite difficult for people who are wanting a more rural context. So really the township and township periphery with more urban zones, but still a great landscape character, are super attractive for projects like this.
Tim, a related question. What about the East Collective? What sort of suburbs are you sort of eyeballing there, please?
So we looked at a site recently in Baldwin North, and I think that group's quite open to sort of Burundara and beyond. kind of that sort of area, Greg?
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks.
Tim,
Sorry.
sorry, John. Tim, could you tell me more about the Nillumbik one? Is that a group of people that are pretty much complete?
No. So the Nillumbik group have formed a council of about 5 sort of core people, and we've been talking to that group since probably midway through last year, and on the 11th of April, they're having a bit of a workshop session where we're sort of going to work through the project and the vision of it, and talk about, you know, joining fees and moving all those people that are interested into, you know, joining that core collective. So that's kind of where it's at, Heather. Yep.
Tim, Henry had a question on whether the client could bring their own architect, and he is also interested in high performance housing, same as Bruce. I think that's the question they were asking. So I suppose Victoria Street is relevant to that.
Yes. So look, I suppose amongst the projects, we do have, I suppose, a disproportionate percentage of participants who are in the property and construction industry. I think that's partly because, you know, people in the industry are probably a little bit more comfortable with taking that leap and going through the process because they're more familiar with that process. And we have had quite a few architects as members of the group too. In terms of architect selection, we've gone down a few different routes, and we're quite flexible with architect selection. Ultimately, I think Richo kind of touched on it. It is going to be a decision for the group to make around what's
track record, capability, capacity, you know, the typology of dwelling, those sorts of things. And really the easiest way to do that is, like most things, it's sort of identify what the brief is and then go to expressions of interest to likely candidates, which might include, you know, an architect that's friendly or related to one of the members, and they're all given an opportunity to respond or put their proposal forward in response to what the core project vision is. We're also talking to architects that are looking to be a principal sponsor of a collective. So they'll obviously go and seek out other participants on the basis that they are experienced in delivering a particular typology in a location, and basically sort of using that as the basis for generating some business development and an opportunity for themselves to create somewhere where they're going to live. So, yeah, as Tim said, we're very sort of agnostic as to how it would come about and what the end result is, but there is kind of a discipline and an approach to doing that so that people's expectations are managed around remuneration and fees and all those sorts of things that have to be very well set out in a joint venture.
Also, Westwick's an interesting one, Tim, where essentially the community has a very strong sort of focus on the environmental outcome of the project. And so, you know, we sort of assembled a long list and whittled it down to a short list, and then each architect actually presented to the group at the time, and a decision was made at that point, principally on the sort of ESD background of that architect. So that's an example.
It is a good example. I think, so we're working with Zen Architects, who were selected primarily on their track record of delivering high performance homes, but single homes. So they hadn't done multi-residential, and we felt that that was a bit of a risk, but we were quite comforted by the fact that the project architect for that job had come from a practice and he had worked on multi-residential. So that was quite a nice mix of skill sets, and that's where the devil's in the detail, I think, around, you know, who are we going to have on it, the team, you know, who's the people that are going to be delivering our project more so than sort of the brand, because you know, that's critical to a project success, you know.
Yeah, there's alchemy there, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah.
Beyond a logo.
Yeah, exactly.
Totally. And the risk is also, one of the important things about the model is having robust cost planning up front. So it's not an architect leading you down a garden path, promising the world before you get a very confronting sort of price from a builder. Having that, because of the risks that the groups are exposed to, it's critical that you have greater cost certainty in the earlier phases, and having an architect that can work with you through that process is really important.
That's a really good point, Andy. And with Westwick in particular, there's a whole wish list of green initiatives that, with infinite amounts of money, we would adopt everything under the sun to make it, effectively passive house. But the reality is we have to work on return on investment and life cycle cost benefit analysis, because capital is finite. So in a climate like Melbourne, we have to work with the team, the design team, as well as the JV cohort, to actually identify what are the things that are critical and work with those to get something very cost effective and high performance, but then allows us down the track to actually evaluate additional initiatives on merit, rather than a process of stripping back, or what you would hear is called value management. We have what we call a linear design development curve, where linear design development pathway, where we sort of build things in as we break down and we get more certainty along. So it's, as Andy said, how our whole process is about making sure that it's methodical and we can include things, as we can test them and we get further certainty down the track. And that's all about cost planning and design management.
So yeah, on that project, and it is a good example, we're about to brief in our third cost plan. And that's prior to finalising the tender documentation and then going to tender. So, the fact that before we go to tender, we'll have 3 cost plans means that there should be no surprises really when we go to the market, which is good.
I like Neil's question about why do prospective members come to us. It's pretty diverse, isn't it? There's some that are entrepreneurial. There are some that want to co-build, or, they have a whole range of different reasons for turning up and finding our website, don't they?
Yeah, I think from what I can tell, I think there's sort of like a threshold desire to get things more affordably. But coming in pretty close to that is a desire for more control over the process and the outcome. And the motivations around that control, I think, differ, because, people will be looking for high environmental performance and not seeing it, and that's quality to them. Other people will be prioritising, community and wanting to incorporate that into the design. Other people will be prioritising, a shared a common garden, and not being able to find that anywhere in the market. So I think there's that cost and control motivators are really, really powerful. And then, people are sort of seeing the other benefits in different, differently, and weighting them differently, I suppose. But
yeah, there are some that are just like you were at inception with it, just frustrated that there was a shortage of high quality, modest townhome product in a desirable area near public transport. That's fundamentally the role of infill development, is to recycle low density housing into more fit for purpose dwellings for the future, for current residents. So that's at the base level, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's the operating system.
Yeah.
Tim, is there a way of, I don't know precisely how to word this, but sort of lowering the costs by prospective JVers doing some of the work themselves, like searching for sites and.
Yes and no. I think we've found in the past kind of contra arrangements difficult, and that if people want to do more work, that it's better that is sort of treated cleanly as some sort of fee for service arrangement, you know, whether it's, I feel like that's probably a better approach, but
and obviously the outcome there is somebody's particularly passionate about delivering a high value outcome. So it's kind of like that mates rates flipped on its head, that you're actually probably paying, you know, market fees, but you're going to get much more certainty
better value.
That person is going to deliver on their promises.
Yeah.
So Tim, Neil had another question about decisions by majority and special majority.
Yes.
You know, and you know, why do we do it? And will the minority members be unhappy?
Sure. It's a good question. So in the joint venture agreement, we have, you know, it's very clear what everybody's rights are. And part of that is being really clear on decision making and what sort of decisions people are going to have to make and how those decisions are going to be made. So at its most simplistic level, we have sort of categorized the sort of more straightforward, easy, low cost kind of decisions and made them majority, simple majority. Those more strategic and, you know, important decisions around, you know, appointing a builder, for example, or entering into a finance agreement, we've made them special majority decisions. So that's kind of how we balance it out. I mean, it doesn't make sense for everybody to get together for a special majority decision to approve a fee variation from a building surveyor, you know, which may only be $1,500. But it does make sense that, you know, we need a special majority if we're deciding on whether we should bank with Bank Australia or Commonwealth Bank, for example, you know. So, and then in terms of people being happy or otherwise about it, you know, I think the one member, one vote process means that there are no sort of minority participants. Even if you're joining the project for a one-bedroom apartment, you still get the same say as somebody who's joining the project for a four-bedroom townhouse, for example. You know, there's no differentiation on in that respect.
Can I ask further? Necessarily, if you let the majority choose, it means the remainder are not getting the choice they wanted, and are therefore to some extent unhappy. That's what I mean by unhappy. And special majority, you just mean a higher percentage of people. It's not 51%, it's 80%.
It's up to the group to decide, but yeah, I mean, it's not 51 because that's simple. It depends on the size of the group and what sort of feels reasonable. But we have found unanimous decision making problematic in the past, Neil. So we would very much recommend against it.
I agree with you. I was wondering whether whether something nearer to consensus, and consensus then allows for people to dissent if they've got a good reason. I understand it slows things down enormously.
I think, to be honest, Neil, what we find when we run this process is because it's a very transparent process and because people are engaged all throughout it, it's very rare that we get anything other than a unanimous decision, even though legally, you know, we're not enshrining unanimous decision making, if that makes sense. we tend to work through problems and find solutions.
I think it comes back to the approach we try and take, which is about incrementally setting strategies based on our experience and what we expect to anticipate. So it's planning for the worst, and being able to present solutions based on a strategy, so nobody's particularly surprised. And then going back to that same formula, which is all about what are the parameters that we're measuring this project or this development on, and what are we doing to continually achieve that? So most of the time, the decision points are actually one of endorsement. There isn't actually a decision for people to necessarily make. It's choosing a course of action that was pre-planned. And this is where we've arrived at it. It's this bank or this bank, this does this one, or it's this builder or this builder. And these are the pros and cons of these two builders. And this is our recommendation as why you choose this builder. And for the most part, that's a fairly straightforward process.
And it's pretty rational, really. If you've done the work, yeah.
So you'd never discuss a question like do we want to share a laundry or have our own? You would have said up front, everyone has their own laundry and go on from there. Is that right?
Well, that would form part of the development brief at the outset before we've even started the design process, so that becomes a measure of project success. How do we actually underpin the value of the project, knowing that having communal laundry may on paper compromise it from a value perspective, but dramatically improve it from the intrinsic communal perspective of the group, so that's understood and not a cause of disharmony down the track when we actually resolve that. There was a question, and I'm not sure whether we answered it quite specifically. I think Neil and Henrik talked about our expertise in specifically passive house and the various green pathways. For us, it's really a matter of finding the right team that has the necessary experience in certain components of it. With regard to Westwick, we've blended an academic with a very technical sustainability engineer, and they work together to balance those components. And again, it's about a return on investment decision around, achieving passive house is, from a supply chain perspective, probably the most difficult piece, because it's about quality assurance and builder selection and subcontractor selection. It's actually not a particularly complex issue from a design or development management or cost planning perspective. It's really about getting the right builder with the right experience and the right supply chain relationships down the track to do that. So we're definitely up for the challenge. I'd love to do a passive house development. It's probably something that we would see maybe in Canberra or something like that, really stacking up in terms of that whole piece around that life cycle cost benefit analysis. It's not something that we've necessarily seen in Melbourne so far. What we're finding is if we go through a process of identifying best for project in Melbourne, it's a combination of a couple of Green Star pathways that actually result in, low operating cost, low carbon footprint, those sorts of things seem to be much more attractive to the cohorts, rather than putting a big stamp on the front of the building that says passive house, because they start to see the law of diminishing returns in Melbourne sort of precludes passive house at this scale. But that's not to say we won't get a cohort that just adamantly wants to do that. And we'd be up for the challenge of doing that for sure.
Further to my earlier question about participation, so I'm interested in a shared facilities model in a rural setting. Would I just talk to you independently about what that might mean? Or?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Is there any other questions? Hi, David. You just turned your video on.
Yeah, sorry, I was otherwise indisposed. I just got a quick question, and I was jumping from phone to this, so it may have been answered and I may have just missed a bit.
Yep.
When you've got the initial group of land people who are in the position where they buy the land together, which will be a smaller group, I imagine, then will eventually move in, how do you transfer that? Like, so 10 people might spend $6 million. I'm from Sydney,
Yes.
$4 million buying a block of land.
Yeah.
And 20 people might eventually live there. How does that initial 10 recoup or rebalance that cost that the later people didn't spend?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. So I think there's two things. One is purchasing a piece of land, and the other one is what the settlement terms are. Yeah, so if you're in that position, the settlement terms will become very critical to the outcome. So if you had 10 at the start and you're looking to do 20 dwellings, I mean, we would be recommending that let's try and get at least a 12-month settlement, you know, and if it was that sort of site, you know, a lot of vendors are open to longer settlements because they know that that's kind of what's required to sell their site at the price that they want it, you know. There's always a trade-off between price and time, you know, when negotiating acquisitions. So if I took that example, David, you know, you might have, you know, that $6 million site, you could negotiate a 5% deposit, so it's 300K on purchase. You've got 10 people then splitting that 30K each. If you locked in that 12-month settlement, that would be then enough time to bring on extra partners. And as those extra partners come on board, they start paying, coming up and contributing the same amount as the original cohort. But say at the end of 12 months, you're still a bit short, you know, maybe you've only got 5, you know, well then what, and we've done this in the past, you know, you would set up that joint venture, you would still have 20 joint venture interests. The 15 people would take 15 interests, that final 5 would be shared equally amongst the other 15. And then when you brought on people post-acquisition, the existing group would then transfer their interest, that interest, to the new people coming on board. So in that example, yes, the 15 are sort of disproportionately carrying the project because it hasn't managed to fully fill up. But, you know, you've sort of reduced that impact through running that process. Yeah.
David, were you asking also whether or not those original foundation JVs would be remunerated or rewarded for carrying it as well?
I guess that's one option, given what Tim explained, that could be one outcome, but not necessarily, it sounds like. I guess that raises another question for me, which is if you ever approach a landholder, like someone who owns maybe 2 big houses or 2 big old lots, and whether there's an equity swap there, but acquisition is acquisition, right? It's not necessarily a cash transfer.
Well, that's right. Look, and there's a number of, you know, once you get into acquisition, everything's on the table and you kind of need to look at a number of different ways of structuring things to make it work. And, you know, we've on the projects that we've got to date, a lot of them have been fairly straightforward. They've been either auction or express private sale. And in lots of ways, they're quite good from my perspective because they're quite transparent, those acquisition processes. Joint ventures with landowners, they're a bit more complex, but they can be extremely rewarding, you know, when you get, when you align the objectives of a landowner with, you know, the future developers or, you know, occupants on that site. So we are starting to do a lot more. We are starting to look at sites, you know, with those sorts of dynamics, which has been interesting.
Tim, maybe just one more question from Haring. He's asking if there's fibre to the premises and what are the facilities that could be had to carry out a business?
Well, I suppose that depends on the site. I mean, if that becomes a requirement for you know, the group, then you know, you would.
Yeah, that's right. So we find a diversity of connections around Melbourne. As we know, it's a bit of a hybrid. Most of the stuff is fibre to the premises. and then it would just be scalable based on what subscription you would want to have. But if it was fibre to the node or fibre to the curb, and that was deemed by the group to be something that wasn't acceptable, then we'd obviously research what would be the cost to upgrade that to a fibre to the premise connection.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, I'm conscious it's 17 past, so maybe we'll just leave it there unless anybody wants to ask one more question.
Probably just to add to that, if somebody's thinking just in terms of building services, typically we are not bringing gas into the developments, they're electric only. So we're trying to wind out fossil fuels from the developments. And we've found that that's a capital cost saving, not bringing that gas in there. And obviously there's not the ongoing connection and service charge to the residents going forward. So it's typically induction cooktops and heat pump hot water units, supplemented with as much PV as we can get on the roof.
Thank goodness for that. That was awesome, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Finn. Thanks for your tricky questions. No. All right. Well, thanks, guys. We've recorded it, so we'll send out the video afterwards, and happy to also share the presentation as well. But yeah, look, feel free to get in contact with us, and yeah, continue the conversation. Cool.
Excellent.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you. See
Bye.
ya.
Cheers, Tim.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.